I've titled my talk, Become Nothing, Be Everything. As a lead-in, I share with you a passage by Dōgen that might sound familiar. Studying the way of the Buddha is studying the self. Studying the self is forgetting the self. Forgetting the self is being permeated by everything. As far as the most crucial things for us to understand as Buddhists, there is not a whole lot to mention apart from this passage. So let's make it today's theme. I will return to it and try to tease out some of the meaning as we go along. In August, many of us attended a two-part seminar given here by a guest speaker, Dr. Calabrese. He gave an excellent presentation on the Jataka tales that was well received by the attendees. He encouraged us to think about the basic question, what is Buddhist? One of the main takeaways was that Buddhism, as we experience it in the Buddhist churches of America, is a blending of elements, some of which are religious observances, and others of which appear to be non-religious cultural activities. In the religious category are familiar customs like chanting, bowing, offering incense, along with listening to Dharma talks. These would be labeled as religious activities by any outside observer. In the non-religious category are the popular events of the community center, such as sports, games, festivals, fundraisers, and cultural practices generally. Again, an outside observer would call these customs non-religious. The point made by the seminar speaker was that all of the activities taking place here, because they are integral to temple life, are to be understood as Buddhist. Most of us will find that point to be reassuring, confirming that everything we are engaged in at the temple is authentic, that all of our customs are faithful to the traditions of the BCA and are therefore to be called Buddhist. But this begs the question of what is actually meant by the adjective Buddhist. The seminar speaker was not so much reflecting upon the word as he was offering a definition for it in terms of activities. In his view, the adjective Buddhist is meant to encompass all activities that are integral to temple life. Not many of us would question such a definition. Even so, this point seems to be of some importance, and we may want to give it further consideration. Are there other ways of asking what is meant by the adjective Buddhist? Come to think of it, I know of teachers who might offer a different definition. For instance, there was once a BCA minister named Gyodo Haguri. Reverend Haguri had a keen appreciation for Shinran's teaching, and he said this: "The first step in becoming Buddhist, for no one is born Buddhist, is to awaken to the true nature of the self. This requires that we constantly listen and hear the teachings. Sometimes it means relentless self-reflection and talking with our religious teachers. And always it will demand our greatest effort and sacrifice, for the goal is priceless." Here, Sensei is proposing a definition that differs from the first one I shared with you, which drew together the entire set of temple activities to define the adjective Buddhist. Instead, Reverend Haguri is saying that becoming Buddhist demands the initial step of awakening to the true nature of the self. Note that he speaks of becoming. It's not a fixed identity. There's no end point to the process. Rather than saying, "I am Buddhist," it might be better to say, "I am becoming Buddhist." Further, Reverend Haguri asserts that this becoming cannot occur in the womb. In his view, no one in our day is born Buddhist, although soon after being born, we begin having experiences that could contribute to our becoming Buddhist. For Reverend Haguri, awakening to the true nature of the self is the first step on the Dharma path, and I would add that it is every subsequent step on the path of becoming Buddhist. And note that our greatest effort and sacrifice are necessary, the goal being priceless. Now, you could argue that by grabbing at Reverend Haguri's words, I have simply kicked the can down the road, because his definition requires further explanation. Here, let's recall the passage I shared with you at the outset about forgetting the self. It helps us to understand awakening to the true nature of the self. It describes Siddhartha Gautama's awakening while meditating under the Bodhi tree, when he became aware that the self he thought he had, the self that always tries to gain an advantage, well, that fabricated self he saw was an illusion. Poof, it disappeared. And as the old self became nothing, a new self was revealed to him, the self that is permeated by everything. In forgetting the self, in becoming nothing, Siddhartha could now be everything. That was his awakening. Taken this way, to become Buddhist is to become Buddha. In an ultimate sense, that is the meaning of becoming Buddhist. It is to experience the same awakening as the historical Buddha. Let's keep Siddhartha's awakening in mind while recognizing that we do not begin by taking a seat under the Bodhi tree as he did. For us, there must be stages of seeking, call them waypoints, on the path of becoming Buddhist. A spiritual aspiration, the desire to seek the way, is the necessary starting point. Hence, we must first consider what can turn us into spiritual seekers in the first place. That is, people like Siddhartha who are led to doubt worldly values. I suggest that becoming a seeker begins with the arising of questions such as these. What am I? Or what are birth and death? Or why is there sorrow? If we feel that there is no escape from existential questions, the Dharma gateway will indeed appear. What I mean by the gateway will appear is that we become receptive to the Buddhist teachings. They cease to be abstractions. The scriptures now become personal. Dharma listening is then our most urgent priority. And I would claim that listening in this way is how we start to awaken to the true nature of the self. It is starting to become Buddhist. I'm not speaking theoretically. This is actually how the Dharma Gateway appeared for Janice and me 19 years ago. Having shared with you now 2 ways of defining the adjective Buddhist, I will comment on another point made by the seminar speaker, Dr. Calabrese. After suggesting that temple activities are what defines Buddhist, he contrasted that view with a different one, the notion that what truly makes a person Buddhist is learning religious doctrines. Take the example of the ministers and ministers' assistants. It might seem that their vocation is to learn religious doctrines in order to give Dharma talks. Looked at in that manner, ministers are like college professors. They amass doctrinal knowledge in order to dispense it to the members, who lack the ability to acquire such knowledge on their own. That is an impression that some people might have. But I don't think it matches up with the theme I'm sharing with you today, which suggests that becoming Buddhist is forgetting the self and being permeated by everything. Becoming Buddhist is therefore subjective experience. It is not confined to gaining objective knowledge about Buddhism or its doctrines, although that is a necessary waypoint for us on the path. But learning doctrines alone does not define the adjective Buddhist. To that extent, I concur with the seminar speaker. Let's look again at Reverend Haguri's statement. The first step in becoming Buddhist, for no one is born Buddhist, is to awaken to the true nature of the self. This requires that we constantly listen and hear the teachings. Now, the common sense interpretation would be, I must listen and reflect in order to awaken to the true self. We can easily grasp this logic because it matches our everyday way of getting the things that we desire. And indeed, listening in that frame of mind is a necessary waypoint for us on the path. But Shinran challenges our customary reasoning. As his awareness deepened, he ceased to engage in Dharma listening as a means for awakening in the future. Rather, the Dharma listening that he describes is awakening to the true nature of the self here and now. There's no distinction between the means, listening, and the end, awakening. For Shinran, listening itself is awakening. That is becoming Buddhist. This might sound like magic, but I can assure you that is not the case. How then does it occur? The necessary external condition for Shinran's type of Dharma listening, for awakening to the true self, is meeting the teacher. It is to encounter an authentic lineage holder in the Dharma path identified by Shinran. Or to use a Zen expression, it is to meet a Buddha ancestor. Listening to his teacher Honen was the pivotal event in Shinran's life. He says that without this meeting, his entire life would have been spent in vain. Shinran's main writing is nothing but an explanation of what took place through this meeting. The true nature of the self, which had been hidden from view, emerged unexpectedly in Shinran when he understood what Honen represented. Honen stood within the line of teachers and students, extending back over the centuries to the teacher Shakyamuni and the student Ananda, as recounted in the story of the larger sutra. Through meeting Honen, Shinran experienced the same awakening as Ananda. It can be said that the authentic teacher is the person before whom the self is forgotten. The self that always tries to gain an advantage becomes nothing. That is a way of describing the meeting that occurs time and again on the great road of Buddha ancestors. The student's sense of fixed identity, whether religious or worldly, is negated. Awakening means that the self we thought we knew, our fixed identity, that self dies, and the new self appears as freedom. Summed up this way, forgetting the self is being permeated by everything. One ceases to be concerned with maintaining a persona that is either religious or worldly. If you are at a waypoint where Shinran's teaching seems like an abstraction, then what I am saying might sound exaggerated or overly dramatic. Trust me, it isn't. The authentic teacher is the person before whom the student's self is forgotten, as when Ananda met Shakyamuni. That is precisely what occurred when the senseis from whom I have learned met their own teachers. A prime example: the student Marvin Harada first met Reverend Kupose in Chicago, and later he met Professor Shigaraki in Kyoto. Marvin Harada, the student, became nothing in the presence of his teachers, as a result of which he was able to be everything, a fact to which many of you can attest from having observed our teacher, Reverend Harada. Consider Shinran's famous autobiographical statement. Having awakened to the true nature of the self, having become nothing, he says, "I am now neither a priest nor a layperson." Here, Shinran has discarded the fixed identities that he cherished formerly. Within the labeling conventions of his day, he is saying, "I am not Buddhist." Or, looked at differently, his statement might imply the idea of being both a priest and a layperson. Either way, Shinran places himself outside the frame of reference that existed in medieval Japan, and he remains outside the commonly accepted Buddhist reference frame that exists today. From this, we may gather that the question, "What is Buddhist?" does not lend itself to an easy answer in the context of Shinran's teaching. But I think we will be heading in the right direction if we reflect again on our theme for today. Studying the way of the Buddha is studying the self. Studying the self is forgetting the self. Forgetting the self is being permeated by everything. Thank you very much for listening. Namo Amida Butsu. Naman Dabutsu. Naman Dabutsu.